Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Yes, we're doing a little bit of leftover Christmas candy again. The candy cane's broken, but that's what happens when you get this late into January. So we're redoing what we normally call the Christmas story and continuing it again. And so I hope as you're studying it that you're not off put by the repetition, but also that as you're reading it, you're focusing it and not on these celebrations you have. You don't worry about the shopping list or the party or if you're going to run out of punch, but you're actually focusing on learning about the life of Jesus Christ. And as you're reading, you notice that there's a distinction between our traditions and what you're actually reading in the scriptures. And so we need to focus on the truth rather than the traditions. We have the Christmas specials. You're thinking about your parties, the clothing. You may be sick. But since we're past all that, let's focus on Christ now. And one of the first tools we have, and it's mentioned in the manual, is the Joseph Smith translation. Because what you're reading in the King James Version of the text of the Bible is not necessarily accurate. And I'm going to go into a little bit of that. Joseph Smith said, and this is found in the Far West Record, I have links to all the stuff in the show notes. So Joseph Smith said, let's see, it was page 13 of the Far West Record, or it's now getting called Minute Book number 2. Except the church receive the fullness of the scriptures, they would yet fall. Except the church received the fullness of the scriptures, and we'd understand that to mean the Joseph Smith translation, the inspired version, the new translation of the Bible, as it's sometimes called. It's called all three of those things of the church records. The church would yet fall. And one of the problems is that as we're studying on our phones, we're not catching the footnotes, and you need to come up with a way to catch those footnotes as you're studying, and maybe going back to studying paper scriptures. What I do is when I read the paper editions, I'll scan through first, catch Joseph Smith translations, and put a check mark around the footnote of that to draw my attention to it. So the one in the text, and do a corresponding check mark down below. You can come up with another system, you highlight it all, but come up with something so you're catching these things. It's really important. Let me go into a little bit of that. Article of Faith number 8 says that we believe the Bible to be true as far as it is translated correctly. But it's not just a matter of getting a better translator or getting a better sense of Greek and Hebrew and having a panache for the English language. There's problems with the inherent source text. Joseph Smith taught, I believe the Bible as it read when it came from the pen of the original writers. Ignorant translators, careless transcribers, or designing and corrupt priests have committed many errors. And you can find that in teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. You also find a little bit of discussion on this on the church topics and also with the Joseph Smith Manual, chapter 17, where it talks about the plan of salvation, how a lot of stuff that's in there was missing. And another thing to think about is that the whole translation process overlapped. As Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon, he got sections from the Doctrine and Covenants. And some of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were actually given during the Joseph Smith translation, the most famous one being section 76. So it's just an ongoing, it's not a discrete, compartmentalized process. It's all going on. It's all overlapping. And here's something else to think about. As you read the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi 13 talks about this process where you have the Bible starts out and it gets put into the hands of the great and abominable church. They take out stuff, and the Bible that's now been adulterated, it gets put hands in the discoveries and the founding fathers and makes it over here to the New World. And as it spreads, it creates problems. So that's 1 Nephi 13, 20 through 29. And another thing to think about, too, is in section 21, verse 1, it talks about Joseph Smith being sustained as a prophet, seer, revelator, and translator. Also, this is repeated in section 107, 92. That's a little bit different how we do things now, that we sustain the President Nelson or whoever's the president of the church in the future as prophet, seer, and revelator, but not as a translator. And that's kind of interesting, is why that was a drop, since a seer does have a right to use a seer stone and to translate. And as always, the basic culprit is that we're just not taking stuff seriously, so we're not going to get more until we start taking stuff seriously. When we can study the Book of Mormon on our own, we don't need a ward or stake or a church goal to read the Book of Mormon. That's the first step. So just to sum up all this is that we love the Bible. We realize the inherent flaws. Part of Joseph Smith's mission, this was a branch of his calling, was to do the Joseph Smith translation. And we have it from what we have, and it can be improved. And there's a little bit of technical debates about it, but as you say, it's not a matter of just translation, but dealing with the source text. And if you were to read like the NIV or other translations, I know Elder Uchtdorf does this a lot in his conference talks where he uses other translations. The drawback with that is if your source text is corrupt, it doesn't matter how you translate it. It's just this problems with the source text, and that gets restored. And that becomes really important with where you have lengthy changes. For example, the Book of Moses is a Joseph Smith translation. Next week, we're going to be studying John chapter 1, and the entire chapter has a chapter-length Joseph Smith translation changes in it. Same thing with Matthew 24 and what we call Joseph Smith Matthew. Those are all very lengthy changes with the King James text, and sometimes you're just better off getting a Community of Christ Bible with the Joseph Smith translations integrated into the text. Another place to go to is called centerplace.com, where they have the Joseph Smith translation online. So let's get into the New Testament. And this is familiar territory. We were studying it last month, or hopefully you were, squeezing this in between the Frosty the Snowman and Rudolph specials and Charlie Brown. Those are all fun. The Magoo, the Mr. Magoo Christmas Carol, or the Muppets Christmas Carol. That's fun. It's you can have fun with it, but let's study the actual facts and get past the tradition. So first of all, and this goes back to Joseph Smith translation, is that the taxation decree, it wasn't to all the world. Joseph Smith translation says that the emperor wanted his empire. And now this is a scholarship question. The word tax may not mean tax, it just maybe mean enrolled or registered. So this is sort of more closer to a census, necessarily taxation. Another problem is, and apologies to Michael McLean, Mary and Joseph, they're not homeless. They're displaced due to government bureaucracy. They're employed, they had a home, they're just to comply with the government stuff is the reason why they didn't have a home. So they had a housing situation, but they weren't chronically homeless as we understand the problem. So that's taxation. Another thing, this is get to the point. We do things kind of quick. Shepherds and angels. I guess for that is, remember that in the New Testament, the angels aren't singing, they're speaking. And this is more of a Handel's Messiah, where it used to get the text associated with music. However, in the Book of Mormon, in Mosiah 2:28 and Mormon 7:7, it does actually talk about angels singing. So you get the best of both worlds. You're being true to the text, or they're just declaring stuff. So Jesus is born, and then they take him to Mary and Joseph take him to the temple to be circumcised. And this raises another question about the relationship between the law of Moses and the law of the gospel. For example, this gets talked about in the Book of Mormon several places. 3 Nephi chapter 1, verse 24 and 25. And Abinadi talks about this in Mosiah chapter 13 through 16. Is like, okay, where does the law of Moses fit in? Because it was put in there. You had people living the law of the gospel, then they lived the law, and they had the law of Moses put upon them. And then, do we keep the law of Moses? Circumcision was an everlasting covenant, but then we don't practice it now. And it gets cleared up in the Book of Mormon, this relationship between the two. But Christ submitted to the law of the gospel, but also the law of Moses. Christ said salvation is of the Jews, and that's in John 4:22. But did he say anything else? Was there anything else? Because people just get attached to one verses. So it's a complex problem. Read the Book of Mormon, and I think I've gotten to the point on that. Wise men. So we have no idea about the number. We use 3 because of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And who are these people? We don't know. The Greeks use the word magi, and people think that they're astrologers. So were these just righteous Gentiles who understood the signs? We also keep in mind is that you had Jews living in the East during the Babylonian captivity. You have Daniel was an example of that. Another one is you have Jonah preaching to Nineveh. And so they had contacts with people in the East, had contact with Jews, and with Hebrews. They may have had access to these, and these could be people who were converts who were just not recorded, and they're just sort of like kind of like the lost tribes. They're out there, they're doing the stuff, but when they come back in, they get the sign, and they were able to follow it and obey it as best they could. So another question about the timing is that, as you read in Luke, they're at a house. So they're not at a stable. They're not. There's no manger there when the wise men show up. They're at a house, and at this point, we think it's about 2 years, because remember what happens. You have the intrigue between the wise men and King Herod, and the wise men show up to Herod. It's okay, where's the king of the Jews? And Herod has no idea. So you have a star there, but it wasn't like kind of like brilliant, maybe as we do it, as we have it in our depictions. It may have been there, they could have seen it, but just you had to recognize it. And so that's another interesting question, why Herod didn't recognize the star in the heavens, but the wise men did. And so they had the intrigue. Says, you go find him, you come back to me so I can worship him. We know that's just, just a ruse that he's doing. So the wise men visit Jesus, and then they don't go back to Herod. So what Herod does is he orders the slaughter of what we call the slaughter of the innocents, killing of the children under the age of 2 years. And that's one of the clues we have to the timeline. This may have been up to 2 years after Jesus Christ was born. And so, in the recent church video, they have Jesus coming out, and he's about a 2-year-old kid. And that seems really funny to us, that you have these old wise men making obeisance to a young kid, but that was part of the tradition. For example, in 2 Kings 11:21, Jehoash was 7 years old when he ascended to the throne. Now, we have an age limit on president. It's 35 years. And then, we have age limits, 25 for representative, 30 for senator, and 35 for president of the United States. So we don't get things like Pet the Younger or some of these young kings on thrones here in the United States of America. Back then they did it. Plus, these people who were born into royal families just grew up knowing it. For example, King Charles III grew up knowing that he'd be king. Prince William knows that he's going to be the next king of England when his father dies. And they grew up knowing this, so there's no kind of confusion. But also the subjects understand this, that this person's the king, and you don't pay attention to the age. So there's a little bit of a skip, and then we see Jesus at 12 years old, and his parents attended the Passover in Jerusalem. He ditches out, and he's talking to the religious leaders there. And another Joseph Smith translation. The leaders, they were hearing him and asking him questions. Jesus was listening to them, and they were asking questions of him, but he was also turning the tables on them. And this guy, Jesus, was a child prodigy, and that's what they're that's why they were so interested in him. So is this a bar mitzvah? The bar mitzvah developed during the Middle Ages, so yeah, there would be an anachronism. But you do have a sense of a Jewish boy coming of age around 12 and 13 years old. 13 is the age of the bar mitzvah for boys, and 12 is for the bat mitzvah for girls. But around that age, that's when a Jew would understand, okay, this person's coming of age. This is how a person becomes an adult. And the questions. So you understand that asking questions is really important part of religious life. For example, with the Passover, it begins with the children asking questions of the parents, and the parents explaining the Passover. Now, you have this other thing. Let me grab it. I should have prepared a little bit better. This is a selections from the Talmud, and that's the main religious text after the Bible that Jews rely upon. And it's just rabbis debating what the law means. What does this passage of Scripture mean? One rabbi says this, Shammai, Rabbi Hillel says the other thing, the third rabbi over here. And so that's a Jewish religious habit, that you ask questions to get answers and to clarify the gospel. And you have the same thing in Christians with Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, where he's asking questions to clarify Christian doctrine. And you also have the use of catechisms. That's a little bit more of a Protestant thing. But you also have the same thing in the Restoration, and that's the thing of the church, is we want people to ask questions. So I'm kind of curious about why people think you shouldn't ask questions unless it's a pride question, where someone feels embarrassed about being ignorant, so they don't ask the question, or a leader or a person feels prideful because they're embarrassed they don't know the answer. And that's something we need to get past, be able to process questions and answering. Then the next thing is Christ's development. He increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. But yes, there's another Joseph Smith translation on Matthew chapter 3. It's listed as Joseph Smith, Matthew 3, 24, 26, but I think it's in the back of the scripture in that section where it also talks about Jesus' development. The best doctrinal explanation of Jesus' development is in section 93, and it's section 93, verses 12 through 14, where Jesus went from grace to grace until he achieved a fullness. And that's really important. I'll talk about that a little bit later. That even though Jesus was God, he still had to go through development. And this really rubs people the wrong way when I say that. But we had an interesting debate in church history with B.H. Roberts, debated a Catholic priest in Idaho named Reverend Vanderdonk. And it's been published as the Mormon Doctrine of Deity. And that's one of the things they discuss is like, okay, God's perfect, Jesus is God, but Jesus developed, God doesn't change. Well, Jesus didn't have a body. He got born, he had a body. He died, so he changed by losing a body. Then he resurrected, so he changed by getting a body. And that's kind of interesting. These are sort of high-level questions that, you'd really need to sort out. And this whole thing where you're showing up to church, you're sitting down, you're playing video games on your phone or what have you. You show up to church unprepared. That's just not going to work with these types of questions. So you just push the questions out of your mind and focus on organizing activity and eating sugary refreshments. Come on, that's what's holding us back. So those are the main bullet points from this lesson that I'd like to talk. Wow, I'm at 16 minutes. This is supposed to be get to the point. So let me wind this up really quick. The Christ quotient. First of all, we have all these unusual signs around Christ's birth. And once again, the Book of Mormon talks about the signs that attend his birth. And I think part of it has to just make no mistake who this is. Yeah, this is Jesus Christ, and there's unusual things attending it. This is just not another Jewish baby being born. The other thing, too, is questions and learning, that questions are how you learn stuff. And if a church leader or a person or a friend doesn't know the answer, or you can't find the answer in the scriptures, you can always ask God. God's smarter. God has more information than your church leader has. God has more information than is contained in the scriptures. The encyclopedia I read last year, 2 years ago, or whenever I read it, it was 2 years ago, has more information than's in the scriptures, but God has even more information than the encyclopedia. And lastly, about development, is that section 93 talks about this, that how Christ developed, how he went from grace to grace, is how we develop. It says, I give unto you these things that you may understand and know how to worship, and know what you worship. People worship the incorrect things. People worship their false ideas about God, and it creates problems. I had a friend of mine recently did what she called a faith transition, and when she's talking about it, that you're believing a lot of weird stuff that's not the gospel. So I'm not sure you left the church because your ideas don't represent what the church teaches. So this may actually be an improvement because you're believing a lot of weird stuff that just isn't true. So know what you worship, that you may come unto the Father in my name, and in due time receive of his fullness. For if you keep my commandments, you shall receive of his fullness, and be glorified in me, as I am in the Father. Wherefore I say unto you, you shall receive grace for grace. And coming unto the Father and receiving grace for grace, that's the point.